Okay guys, it's Record, and this is the official tutorial for Conversations by the House Jacks. This is off of their 2010 album, Fitchy Grikko, and the beatboxer on this is going to be Mr. Wes Carroll, who kind of spent a long time with the House Jacks. So I'm going to break down this beatbox line pretty simply. First, I'm just going to show you kind of how it goes in real time, and then I'll break it down kind of through the syllabic methods that I use. And if you guys want to use that, then you can. Then you're welcome to kind of use my methods to try to play the song if you want. It's all kind of for fun. There's no kind of required knowledge that you need for the song, so you can definitely just kind of use my methods to kind of do whatever you want with this line. And yeah, it's just kind of mainly for kind of educational and entertainment purposes, so you can see kind of how beatbox lines break down and kind of how they break down in their specificity. So without further ado, this is the official beatbox line for Conversations by the House Jacks. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of break down this line in syllabic content. So if I'm going to explain kind of syllabic content, then just kind of to get some context, the techno line Boots and Cats, which people kind of use as a joke, that is actually syllabic content. So essentially what you're doing there is you're creating syllables for the actual sounds of the drum set, aka your beatbox sounds themselves. So if I have Boots and Cats, Boots would be the kick drum, Cats would be your hi-hat. And what's perfect about that is that that is actually the techno beat itself. So that's Boots and Cats. Boots and Cats and Boots and Cats and Boots and Cats and Boots and Cats and Boon. So it's pretty straightforward. I'm basically taking syllables and then translating them into my beatbox sounds. That's basically what you're doing. So if I'm going to do that in the context of this song, Conversations, it will basically sound like this. So the original beatbox line is... So now I'm going to translate that to buff to buff tough above cuff. So again, original, and then translation, buff to buff tough above cuff. So the syllabic content version is... Buffer to cuffer to buffer tuffer buffer cuffer tuffer buffer to cuffer to buffer tuffer buffer cuffer tuffer buff. Okay, so I'm going to break that down. So what I just did there was just kind of the real-time version. So, you know, this groove itself kind of breaks down to two different sections. We have kind of the beginning section, and then we have the ending section. First of all, we have to know what is actually part of this groove. So, you know, oftentimes, like with beatbox grooves, the difference between beatboxing and drumming is with drumming, you know, you obviously have way more flexibility. You have a lot more instruments you can choose from. With beatboxing, what you're aiming to do is replicate as much as you can with your mouth. That being said, you will have a more limited number of sounds because you're using your mouth naturally. So what that means is some sounds will kind of blend more into one. So like the cymbal sound in beatboxing could also sometimes be interpreted as the hi-hat. There's a little more flexibility there. Snares can be rim shots. You know, it all depends. Because some snares sound more like rim shots if you're duplicating like an artificial drum set. So there's all these kind of little technicalities to keep in mind there. But that being said, in this groove, all you're really using is your kick, hi-hat, and your snare. So once again, that's your kick, hi-hat, and your snare. If I'm going to play this on the kit, I would also kind of implement just kind of that as your bass. So that is your bass. And when you're breaking down a groove, as long as you kind of know where your bass rides, then you're okay. And then from there, you can kind of experiment. So now that we know what's actually in this groove, let's break it down. Okay, so the first part of this groove is buffer to cuffer to buff. Once again, that's buffer to cuffer to buff. So once again, buffer to cuffer to buff. It's really important that you get all those syllables kind of distinct. I could also sing baka da daka da da, baka da daka da da. Oftentimes on my students when I'm teaching drums, I'll kind of sing the syllables so you can get the rhythm. So buffer to cuffer to buff. Again, that's buffer to cuffer to buff. That's the first part of the groove. So that's going to be your kick, your rim, and back to your kick, essentially. Or, yeah, and then with your hi-hat as the filler. So kick, rim, kick, with your hi-hat as the filler. So buffer to cuffer to buff. One more time. Buffer to cuffer to buff. That's your first part. So what that sounds like is buffer to cuffer to buff. Again, buffer to cuffer to buff. And at the end of this video, kind of once I've broken down the whole groove, I'll show you kind of how to move your syllabic content into the actual sounds, because what's nice about the syllabic content is you can actually hear the sounds within the syllabic content, and that's the whole idea, because the syllabic content is kind of a really direct way to use the sounds so you can understand kind of the sounds and how they work. So that is your first part of your groove. All right, so your second part of the groove is actually going to be tuffa, buffa, cuffa, tuffa. So once again, that's tuffa, buffa, cuffa, tuffa. If I'm going to sing that in the beatbox style, it's going to be again. So that's essentially the second part of your groove. And what that breaks down to is your hi-hat, kick, rim, hi-hat. So once again, that's hi-hat, kick, rim, and hi-hat. So now what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to break down, I'm going to do the whole groove one more time in both versions. And then I'm going to kind of show you how to transition from your syllabic content to the beatbox style. Buffer to cuffer to buffer tuffer buffer cuffer tuffer buffer to cuffer to buffer tuffer buffer cuffer tuffer buff. Okay, so now let's take a step back and think about how to translate our syllabic content into the actual beatbox sounds. So the sound that I kind of like to use as a bass for this is the bass drum, because it's kind of your bass, pun intended, in your kind of beatbox lingo. So your bass drum is going to be your ba. And, you know, as I did in the last exercise with the second part of conversations, what you're doing there is, like, I use the buffa, which is your bass. So we're going to use that sound to kind of demonstrate how to translate into beatbox sound. So first I'm just going to go from a bass buffa sound, so the buffa vowel, to a beatbox sound and back in slow motion. So let's start with that. Buffa, 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 buffa. Buffa, 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 buff. Okay, so now you guys kind of heard me do like a rough version of kind of going back and forth between syllable and sound. That's basically the idea. So now we're going to translate that into the conversations groove, and then this concludes this tutorial. And please feel free to kind of go back and pause the video at any time. Try to do all the stuff yourself. Look at certain parts, kind of try to think about how to do it in your own way. Because also keep in mind, the other thing about beatboxing is you can really create your own style with this stuff. I'm just kind of giving you a guide with where to get started, which hopefully kind of opens up the door to you kind of inventing it yourself, essentially. So, you know, feel free to take this sound and, kind of create your own version of a kick drum sound. Create your own version of a rim saw, you know, your own version of a hi-hat. Really play around with these sounds to try to make them your own, because that is part of what beatboxing really is. So that being said, let's go backtrack again, go into the groove, and think about how does this sound. So now I'm going to do the groove conversations. We're going to do conversations starting with syllabic content into the beatbox sounds, just like what I just did with the bass, but now with the entire groove. Buffer to cuff to buffer to buffer cuff to buffer to cuff to buffer to buffer cuff to buffer cuff to buff. Okay, so now the hard part. This is how you actually do it. So again, you know, this is kind of one direction. There's a lot of different ways to kind of create a beatbox sound and kind of create just the sound of a drum set. I'm using the syllabic content method, so I'm really kind of taking basically a vowel and translating it into a beatbox sound. So I'm going to go back again with the bass. I'm not going to go through this with the entire groove. If you guys want, you can pause the video to where I actually do the groove from syllabic content and back and kind of try it yourself. But this is basically the technique behind it. So you're starting with the vowel, the open vowel. So say we have buff again, so just buff, like I did in the previous clip where I was kind of going back and forth. So we have buff. If you have that concept of buff, the syllable, in order to translate that into a kick drum sound, all you're really doing is you're slowly but surely closing your mouth, essentially. The kick drum sound I'm using consists of purely air and my tongue directly between my teeth. So if you think about making a TH sound, the, right? The, just in the English language, the. We're taking that the and we're slowly removing the vowel. If you think about it deleting, like a deleting tile, you're removing that. So, for example, the, until I just have the spit. You know, I just have the tongue. So what I just did there was actually an example of a hi-hat sound, for instance. So let's try that now with the kick drum sound. So again, we have buh. So I'm going to use buff, right? So buff. So we have buff. So basically buff would be your kick drum and your hi-hat. So let's actually backtrack. Let's just do the kick. So we have, because basically the reason for that is because your Fs are your hi-hat, your bass is B, your Ks are going to be your rim saw, so that's kind of the idea. So let's just do buh instead of buff, because that's a little easier right now. So let's just do buh. So buh, buh, buh. So that's the B letter, the letter B. Buh. If I was going to write this down, I would just use the letter B too. So just buh, 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 buh. Again. Ba, 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 ba. So what I'm doing there is I'm removing the vowel. My tongue is directly between my teeth for the ba sound. Ba, 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 ba. Again. Ba, 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 ba. So just think about slowly removing the vowel. Ba. And kind of think about moving your tongue as well. Your tongue kind of goes from where it is in the B sound, ba, which is kind of more at the bottom. You're moving it more towards the middle. Ba, 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 ba. Until you want a really clear sound. It's going to sound like a spit when you try it. And, you know, this is why this is only one method. You can also do another optional kick drum sound is just using your which some beatboxers do. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So the way that I do it is ba, 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 And if that doesn't work, try something else. But essentially, what I'm doing is I'm moving my tongue a little more upward in my mouth, and I'm removing the vowel sound. So that's the concept. So one more time before the end of this video, to apply all this to Conversations by the House Jacks, I'm going to go through just real quick and talk about what am I doing with each sound. At the beginning, I talked about there's 3 sounds in this groove: your kick, hi-hat, and your rim. So let's try that. So I talked about the kick. So for the hi-hat, tuffa, 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 tuffa. So again, so basically with this, you're kind of blowing out a little more. So tuffa, 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 tuffa. Tuffa, 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 tuffa. Essentially, you're closing your mouth a little more, and you're removing your vowel sound. Tuffa, 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 tuffa. Until once again, your tongue kind of moves upwards more towards the middle of your mouth. Tuffa, 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 tuffa. Again. Tuffa, 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 tuffa. One more time. Tuffa, 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 tuffa. So together, if I'm going to do the first part of the groove, buff to cuff to buff. One more time. Buffa to cuffa to buff. It's going to be buffa to cuffa to buff. Buffa to cuffa to buff. So in order to really get this down, I would start with the vowel buffa to cuffa to buff. Just that phrase. And then slowly close your mouth on it. Buffa to cuffa to buff. A little more closed. Buffa to cuffa to buff. A little more closed. Buffa to cuffa to buff. A little more closed. Buffa to cuffa to buff. A little more closed. Buffa to cuffa to buff. Until eventually you're kind of deleting the vowel. So I really think about it as a dial, I think about it as a dial, like I said earlier, or a tile of just like you're moving the button and the vowel is kind of slowly going away. And then you can move it back like I did before. So buff to cuff to buff, buff to cuff to buff. Same thing with the second part of the phrase. So tuffa, buffa, cuffa, tuffa. Tuffa, buffa, cuffa, tuffa. Tuffa, buffa, cuffa, tuffa. So I would really break down a groove every time you're learning a song, break down the groove into 2 sections and think about each phrase individually. So for this we have buffa to cuffa to buff, tuffa, buffa, cuffa, tuffa. So first phrase, try that, and then slowly remove the vowel. Think about how does this consonant sound without the vowel, basically. So like you have a consonant like ba, what is that going to sound like without the vowel? So that's a starting point. But then from there, just think about the dial it back, dial it forward, and that is your concept. So thank you for watching the tutorial for Conversations by the House Jacks, linked below, and I'm Record. Take care.